We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning.
Claire, thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So before we get into the conversation, could you tell the audience just a bit of what it is that you do?
Yeah, it's a pretty broad list of things that I do, right? So I think the best way to sum it up is I'm a multidisciplinary artist and storyteller. So I work in several mediums, photography and writing and music. And then for my day job, I'm a therapist for one of the practices here in town at Mount North, and I'm working on getting their podcast started, mental health podcast about wellness topics with a focus on the community here. So, yeah.
Yeah, I saw whenever I was looking through kind of like your Instagram and your Substack and things that you've worked on, that you used to work in a crisis center that kind of focused around that part of mental health. And I was really interested to get to talk to you about that. And I mean, whatever you're willing to share, because that is a personal topic, with things that you were handling. But I would like to kind of talk to you a little bit about what it is that I think or that drew you to the field of therapy and helping other people in that manner.
Yeah, I think for a long time I tried to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
I was working in the arts, working for a gallery, and it was glamorous and I was well taken care of. And there were many things that I loved about that scene in that world. But I think if you are someone who has the call for the helping professions, your soul isn't going to be satisfied unless you get into them and you make that your vocation, right? There's a difference between a job and a vocation, right? A job is anything we can do for money. A vocation is a calling. And I think if you ignore the call, whatever it is for you, you're going to have a bad time.
Yeah.
And I think like many therapists, doctors, I had been through some things in my life and I was helped through them through the generosity of other people. And I wanted to be able to give back to the world, right? I think if you go through hell, you have, not to oversimplify it, but you have one or two options. You can become bitter and close-hearted, and the world is full of examples of people like that, right? But for me, that was always an example of what I didn't want to be. I didn't want to be that jaded, bitter person, right? Or you can, come back from hell and use what you learned there to help other people who are going through it. And so that's what I wanted to do. And, it's never perfect. There's always more to learn and, things to stay humble about, but it has given me a meaningful path here. So that's, I think, the long and the short of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting because I think that's something that I have definitely felt a lot, especially recently as I really start to kind of think, how can I best make an impact in the world that isn't just for myself, but actually helps other people. Steve Jobs, of all people, has this quote that I really like, where he said that it's kind of the role of us as individual people to contribute to the river of humanity in some kind of way, because it's like we're all moving forward together, and if we're not kind of bringing our own water into it, then not that we're doing something wrong, but that, like you said, it's we're touching on something that maybe is unfulfilled in our life. And so I find that really interesting. And so I think doing that in this area with you kind of, being a therapist who is helping people in kind of the Western PA area, what are things that you see in this area that people struggle with a lot that are kind of bringing down our communities?
Yeah, there's a few things, right? And while I think a few of these things are universal, they show up differently depending on the community you're in and the history and context of that community, right? So things that are especially tough in this region, Northern Appalachian Rust Belt region, is there's intergenerational trauma from the back-breaking work of industry here. This is the sort of work like mining, working in the mills, that is just really tough on the body. And you ask anyone who works those sort of jobs, they often learn to dissociate, right, to get through it. But then when they come home, they don't have much for their families, right, emotionally, at least, right? And so there's that aspect of it. So that's just from a body perspective. From a mind perspective, there is a lot of loneliness, right? Now, people are lonely in cities too. We live in a rural area, right? And, we certainly, don't have loneliness copyrighted. It's everywhere. It's a human condition.
Yeah.
But there are cultural factors that make it a little tougher here when you can't just like walk out of your house and, go to some third space, right? When you have to have a car, right? Which is an economic hurdle to get somewhere, right? That can be tough. And so there's that aspect. Loneliness, struggles with love, right? Which is its own way sort of loneliness, because that's, a struggle to connect with, yourself as an individual, but then a struggle to like bring that authentically to your relationships as well. And then the struggle, I think, to cope with loneliness, right? And to cope with the stressors of relationship, people would sometimes cope with that with substance use disorders. And this was one of the areas that was hit very, very hard by the opiate epidemic. I think almost everyone I know knows at least one person who has not just struggled with it, but one person who has died at least from it, which is a definition of an epidemic, right? And I know there was the Sackler lawsuit, but these families weren't compensated. And there's the grief and trauma left over from that, and the survivor's guilt of the people who did survive, and the families that are still feeling the reverberations of that. So, those I think are some of the big things that, we're all grappling with here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that is a really hard part of our history, and it's not even really history yet because it's so recent, to have to grapple with, is like just what happened with that whole opiate, like you just look at that and it seems like really pure evil, like what those families did, and just how they were so willing to, I mean, really honestly just step over people to make money. I mean, step over people who, it was like you said, I mean, it's kind of this terrible situation that, this community and a lot of communities like it find themselves in, where the surroundings are so oppressive and so hard to handle, and then somebody comes in and says, hey, we have this solution that can help you, and it's actually ends up being like the worst snake oil. And that's really what the opiate thing did. And I think that and I mean, I do see it a lot around here, and it's hard to have to reckon with, because I mean, coming from a family who has had some history with that side of things, but especially more with like the alcohol side of substance abuse, it's it's hard to see how we can kind of make a path forward, and where we can find the beauty in things to be able to help people who are struggling with that. And so I think with you, it interests me because you are on the actual like vanguard part of it, where you're helping people in therapy, but you're also on the art side of it. You're still on that side of it, even though you said that you were once kind of in the gallery scene, and then you decided that you needed to move into something more helpful. How do you see your role as an artist now, as it relates to your role as a therapist?
Yeah, I think My whole life, art, music, writing has been a way of taking what's inside of me and putting it outside of me,
Mm-hmm.
right? To put it simply, right? And when you do that, when anyone does that, when you take something inside of you and put it outside of you, you're changing it,
Mm-hmm.
you're transforming it. And I don't think art is always therapeutic in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's possible actually for it to be the opposite and not feel so great, depending on your relationship to it. But of course, your relationship with art is going to mirror your relationship to yourself. If
Mm-hmm.
you're perfectionistic and hard on yourself, you're going to bring that to your art, right? If you're destructive, you'll bring that to your art, right? But I think as I was going through life, again and again, the artistic process, the artistic practice was the one constant for me. And it was
Mm-hmm.
such a mirror to where I was, right? That relationship, if I was in a place of peace with myself, that relationship was very fulfilling,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I was in a time that was self-destructive, it would hold the mirror. It was a very unforgiving mirror, And when I look back on some of my old work, yeah, I do cringe a little bit. It's like, oh my gosh, that girl was really suffering,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
verdicts out on whether that old work is good or not.
Mm-hmm.
But if anything, it's a mirror to that,
Mm-hmm.
where I was at that time. So I think, as an artist now, the therapeutic training did help me grow up a little,
Mm-hmm.
with my relationship to my work, to be able to become more self-aware of it, um, and be able to be more in alignment with the messages I want to say, and, the imagery I want to use, and the traditions I'm calling on,
Mm-hmm.
just made me more self-aware, which I think I needed.
Yeah. Uh, could you talk a little bit more about those traditions and maybe myths and things that you're calling on whenever you are doing your art? Because I see that a lot in your photography, especially. That's a big part of what it is that you do, where you're bringing in a lot of folklore and a lot of mythology. How do those things kind of tie together with the what you called the bringing out of what's inside to bringing it outside?
Yeah, when I moved back to Pennsylvania, because I did have to leave for a
Mm-hmm.
while, and I'm glad I did. But I think leaving is also what taught me about myself, in that it taught me that I was someone very much of this region.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching an episode with, I was watching a podcast episode. It was an interview with the singer Ethel Cain, who lives
Mm-hmm.
around where she grew up in, like, rural Florida. And I think she actually comes up to Pennsylvania sometimes. And,
Mm-hmm.
people were asking, like, why she lives there. And she says it's close to the well for her, of her inspiration, and the traditions she's calling on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I resonated with that, because living here is what keeps me close to my well too,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think when I moved away, lived away for a while, you start to become sort of a representative of where you're from. You start to
Mm-hmm.
notice the things that are, like, unique about you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because you're in a different context, and, the things you grew up with. And so when I moved back, I made it my intention to really embrace these things that, I had been embarrassed by, or I'd
Mm-hmm.
pushed away, like, when I was younger, right? Um, there was a lot I didn't like about being from Western Pennsylvania, particularly rural Western Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
That was something I really, tried to push away, or thought I had to. But I
Mm-hmm.
think, like a lot of people, we get that realization that this thing we were once ashamed of is actually, like, our greatest strength
Yeah.
once we embrace it, right? So for me, I think it's really important that people who live in rural America tell their own stories,
Mm-hmm.
um, because, for a long, long time, stories have been told about us, by the bigger media outlets. I'm thinking back to those photographs from the 1970s from Johnson's War on Poverty, about Appalachia. And it's just like, the saddest poverty porn you've ever seen, right? But even going back to that, the photographs of the Dust Bowl, right? And things like that are telling a limited story, right? And they're telling a limited story because they're outsiders telling it. And the outsiders have kind of come in with a story to tell. Like they were hired to tell a story, right? So you don't get, the full spectrum of what a local would know or who someone who's still in it would know, right? Because someone who's still in it, those subjects of those photographs are going to really trust you, right? And they're going to show, their full selves around you. And you're going to know the folklore of the region, which is something that I'm very interested in, right? This area was settled, by a lot of Irish, Norwegian, Italian, people from Europe came here and brought over sort of their old gods with them, right? And it's really interesting to see how that meshed with North America, what was already here too, right? So I find that very interesting. And I think too, Pennsylvania, it's like Penn's woods, right? It's wilderness. It's historically wilderness. And the wilderness is always a place of, scary stories or the things that, society is afraid to look at directly. It's also where people go when they need to be alone and they need to find themselves. So I think for all those reasons, this area calls to me.
Yeah. What do you think, what do you see as being the heart of this area and Appalachia as a whole?
Yeah. Appalachia as a whole is tough because it's very diverse.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that is the heart of it, is that it's very diverse. Right. There isn't a single story, of this place. The mountains down in Georgia are very different than what passes through Pennsylvania, which is different in North Carolina, and all of that. But I think the musical traditions here are very powerful. A lot of them stare directly at death. There's one of the older melodies from, I think it's like 1916 or something. This one's from North Carolina, right? But it's that song, "Oh Death," right from the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" They took that old melody for that. Very intense meditation on mortality.
Yeah.
Right. But, people are dying in the mines all the time. It's something that, I think this part of the country has a closer relationship with death because of what we've been through and because of what we've seen than other places. The country as a whole sort of denies death. There's a whole industry around that. But I think it's harder to get away from it here, right? Because of the history.
That's actually really interesting, and that kind of in my head ties back to what you were saying when you were comparing this area to like the Midwest, with the pictures of the Dust Bowl, where in terms of kind of what it is that we're providing for the country at large, it's very similar to what that Midwest area is providing in terms of agriculture, where we're providing like the resources that are kind of allowing the rest of the country to be powered. And in a way that kind of like brings up this image of, I mean, literally a mine. That is what this area is. It's a lot of mines. It's a lot of coal mines, a lot of all these steel plants, all these kinds of things. And it's interesting because it is kind of like, the closer that you get to the well that you have to draw from to feed a nation, to provide for a nation, the harder it is for the people who have to be the gears of that clockwork, for to be the ones to go into those mines and to make what is actually kind of an ultimate sacrifice for the collective to be able to provide for that. And I never really thought about that before, that is where a lot of the pain in this area stems from, is that it's kind of like we're the ones underneath the floorboard who are being stepped on by everybody
Yeah.
else. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now it's like now the images of a Rust Belt. It's the place that has been forgotten because they found better places to get their resources from that isn't from here. And that's the big question that I see a lot of people in this area, in Johnstown especially, um, really reckoning with is it's like, okay, so what do we do now? I mean, because like the whole identity that
Mhm.
we were given, as bad as that identity, as hard as that identity was on us, it's like, what do we do now that that identity has sort of been taken away?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, there's another history of blueprints for what to do, which is the blueprint to fight. I think
Hmm.
of these historic strikes in this region that really inspired entire labor movements, in
Hmm.
particular, the strikes in Pittsburgh, right? The Homestead strikes, the Carnegie strikes, all of that, right? There is a very strong history of fighting back here
Hmm.
as well. If only we can get past our well-earned nihilism, that
Yeah.
is worth it, you know. So yeah, I think it's true. The people who mine the coal, the people who make the steel, they're closer to the means of production,
Hmm.
right? And so they see where it comes from, whereas someone who turns on their light bulb in New York or whatever, they
Hmm.
don't really see what went into that tiny moment,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, and then in a way, that's why another reason why it was so easy for the rest of the country to kind of turn its back on these kinds of areas because all of the innovation could be done in places like in New York and in California and stuff like that because they didn't have to be the ones providing for themselves. They just got to be the ones to kind of use what was use what was provided.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this part of the country, the Appalachian Mountains, I think outsiders can be mystified by it,
Hmm.
sometimes a little scared. There's
Yeah.
like all these cryptid sightings, UFO sightings, like
Yeah.
Mothman, or the UFOs in North Carolina, and I think it's a part of the country that people still feel a little superstitious
Hmm.
about, you know?
Yeah, and it's nice to live in that because it's like we get to we get to be a part of the weirdness. We get to be right on top of that, on top of all that great weirdness that comes from, that whole history. Um, Something else that I wanted to talk about though, and you touched on it a little bit whenever we were talking about your art, was you leaving this area, to go elsewhere. And something that I wanted to ask, and I love the distinction that you made between a job and a vocation. Where are places that your vocation of art and of helping other people, where have those taken you in the world? Where have you found yourself because of that?
Yeah, so I first left when I was in college. I studied abroad for a year in Wales. My dad is a Welsh speaker, so for me, it
Hmm.
was meaningful to go back to that part of the world and understand my ancestry, where I come from, and be there. And, they speak Welsh there, but they also speak English,
Hmm.
right? So it's not like there's a huge linguistic barrier there, but I still felt my Americanness pretty strongly.
Hmm.
That said, there was a lot of overlap because, a lot of people from Ireland and Wales settled around here.
Hmm.
So I didn't feel as out of place as maybe I would have, somewhere else. So, that was interesting. And, that did get me thinking a lot. And then I also lived for some time in New Orleans,
Hmm.
which is another city that has been through the environmental ringer, like
Yeah.
Johnstown. And I say the environmental ringer, but what I really mean is the corporate capitalist disaster capitalism ringer,
Hmm.
where the people who are supposed to steward the systems that keep the community safe neglect them,
Yeah.
and then what results is mass death,
Yeah.
right? And so that was a meaningful place for me to learn and to be.
Hmm.
um especially in terms of what it's like to, make art and not have the resources for it. Louisiana is even, it's struggling even more than Pennsylvania in terms of funding for things, right? But people find a way.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that was very valuable for me to learn. It was valuable for me to learn the music traditions from that part, of the country, um, and the ways of building community, right? And speaking truth to power and keeping a sense of humor about it. And, I really needed that. I grew a lot as a person being away. And I think what that taught me is, a lot of the people I related with the most were people who were living in their communities where they had grown up, living this life, right? It made me reflect on where I was from in rural Pennsylvania. And eventually I came to the realization that that's where I could do the most good, both from an artistic perspective and from a therapeutic perspective as well.
What kind of ways have you collaborated with people both whenever you were abroad and now? Because that's a big part of the photography that I see you doing is a lot of working and drawing out what makes other people really unique, like the uniqueness of their particular form of art. And it makes me really interested because I don't see that. I know that it exists everywhere and that it exists a lot here, but I don't see it a lot in that form of like very close collaboration, the way that I see it with the work that you do.
Yeah. So I think that began because I started to realize that as much as I love to write, it's a very solitary pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a lot of time being by yourself, right? And having conversations with yourself and telling the truth, even if you're writing fiction, you sort of need your space and your solitude to make those things come to life. So photography for me became a way to counterbalance that, right? And I started doing it when I got this music journalism internship and I was going out photographing live music and capturing the energy of spaces, the energy of the bands. And I loved doing that, right? That was great. And it was a really great way to develop technique. All these subjects are moving constantly in low light, and you just take a lot of photographs and you learn from that. And I think too, as I built my community and found my community, I started to realize that, you know, projects can become stronger when you incorporate other people. Like I would notice someone's vibe or someone's way of being, right? And I would just start talking with them. Mostly they were other artists, musicians, because that was just the scene that I was in. But I would show them my work and the conversation would get started. Do you want to make something together? Right. And then we would follow that. Right. And I try to make it so it's a real conversation. It's not like I'm the director, like I'm like Tarantino telling you what to do, right? Yeah. I really like it when someone brings their own inspirations and it's more of this, alchemical fusing of something, right? Because, that's what sparks it. You notice something cool about someone's work or someone's vibe, and you want to, bring it out with the photos. And I feel like I've been blessed to work with a lot of people who I think are like much more talented than me. And I feel lucky to be, in the same room as them. Right. Yeah. And all of that. So, I think again, right, it's a way I've found to deal with loneliness, right? The thing that plagues us all, because it's also authentic. Right. Because if you've ever been in a room of people where you still feel lonely because you feel like you can't be real with them, this sort of artistic practice is like medicine to that.
Hmm.
right? Because you're getting very real with people, and you're expressing, both of you are expressing what matters most to you.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean with that. I mean, because artistically, writing has always been the thing that I've done the most and also am drawn the closest to. But that's actually for the same reason that you were talking about why photography calls to you so much. That's actually why I enjoy and continue to do this podcast for as long as I have, because like it's always been one-on-one. I think there was one or two episodes that I've done with more than one other person. Um, and it is really my way of like I've said this so many times where it's like it's my way of being able to kind of break out of a zone of comfort that I have always kind of locked myself in. And also,
Mm.
it's like a great excuse to get to talk to people who I also find much more talented than I am and much more interesting than I am. And it's like, and it's this great, it's a great time where it's like I can really just pick their brain on like what it is that makes them tick and why they enjoy doing what they do and why they do what they do. And I think that um, collaboration has always been a thing in my life that I've had trouble with just because I don't know, maybe it's just something about the way that my brain works. And so getting to do collaborative things has been, I think, one of my favorite parts about my kind of artistic journey the past couple of years. So I definitely, I know exactly what you mean with the photography side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think a podcast is a great way to do
Yeah.
that. Getting people to tell their stories, and then sharing that too, like with the community too,
Hmm.
right? It's building bridges everywhere in that way.
Yeah. Um, Something that I saw you talk about actually in another podcast that you did was about photography, and you brought up the ghosts in photography, and I thought that that
Mhm.
was really interesting because I've kind of gotten interested in that aspect of photography recently with people like Sharon Taggart and people like that who really are big in like the spectral photography side of things. And I wanted to
Yeah.
actually, I didn't get to listen to that whole that episode that you did with, I can't remember the name of that podcast, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about that side of photography because I've always found the spiritual side of any kind of art, but photography in particular, really interesting.
Yeah. My body of work that I made in Cambria County, Indiana County, Armstrong County is all about the spiritualism
Hmm.
of these areas, right? And photography as a medium has always had a relationship with spiritualism, right? If you think back to like the Victorian parlor ghosts,
Hmm.
right, which was a huge interest, right? It was sort of a stress relief for that repressive moral society. And I think we're seeing a bit of that now, right? We
Hmm.
kind of live in a very restrictive, socially restrictive, morally,
Yeah.
repressive society. And I think, renewed interest in the occult side of art is something that is always a counterweight, like when society swings in that direction,
Hmm.
right? And I think what is fascinating about photography is that like it creates an image that just feels real. And so even after someone passes away, that's still there. And that
Yeah.
is crazy when you think about it,
Hmm.
right? Like when photography first came on the scene in like the 1830s, I think that was like blowing people's minds. It was like
Yeah.
creeping them out,
Yeah.
right? Just in the same way as like when music started to just first become recorded,
Hmm.
on phonographs, like again, that's some ghost stuff right there. It's very, in a way, keeping something that used to be transient,
Hmm.
I wouldn't say alive because a still image really isn't alive, and arguably not even recordings are really alive, right? Because the
Yeah.
moment has passed. But it's a unique medium in that way,
Well,
right?
and in a way too, I can see how that could really terrify people, especially whenever it first comes on the scene, because um, it's like it's not alive, like you said, and that's kind of what makes it the most terrifying because it holds all of the same qualities that it did whenever it was first recorded, but kind of like
Mhm.
without the soul that that live moment holds, and yet it's still showing the same image. And I think that that's kind of
Yeah.
yeah, it's an interesting part of it.
Yeah. And I think the best photographers, just like the best engineers, the best sound engineers,
Hmm.
They're trying to make things as lifelike, as true to life as
Yeah.
possible, right? Like nothing can replace the energy of a lived in moment,
Hmm.
right? But there's a way to, get there,
Hmm.
right? So I think, it's interesting because I feel like a lot of what sound engineers do, a lot of what photographers do is they put life into a dead medium,
Yeah.
you know? So yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's really interesting because that's something that uh, is really interesting about the film side of things too, because in a way it's like that you would think that that would be the closest form to life that there is, which I guess explains why it's the maybe the most popular form of the three mediums, because
Yeah.
it feels so lifelike. But there really is something about photography that is, yeah, that is so um, what's the word? Yeah, I don't know, just so tangible because you can pull so much out of it. Um, so with your photography being one thing, you also do writing. I've seen you do a lot of as well. And that was something that you were saying is kind of what was your first artistic medium. How do you see yourself as a writer fitting in with the rest of the art that you do?
Yeah, I think they're all different channels for the same sort of feeling,
Hmm.
right? And how that feeling or that idea moves through you, I think, you know, is going to depend on what medium you use. I like being able to use a few different mediums though, because, not every medium is the right fit for an idea
Yeah.
or vice versa. I like writing because it's a pretty intimate experience, like holding a book,
Hmm.
right? Um, there's something about that, right? When you sit down and you read something and you feel like you're having a conversation with someone else, even if it's a work of
Hmm.
fiction,
Yeah.
you feel like you're in it in some way, right? And it does something different to our brains than watching movies. Like I
Hmm.
love a good movie. Like I love getting lost in those stories, but it is very different than
Hmm.
reading a novel. And they've even done some research on this, right? And people who read a lot of fiction tend to have more empathy
Hmm.
than people who don't. And I mean, maybe there's some problems with that study. Maybe people who are just naturally more empathetic like to read more, right?
Hmm.
Maybe reading doesn't cause them to be empathetic. But I think when you're reading something, you're really getting into another character's interiority,
Yeah.
right? Into their world. And even if they're a character who does like quote unquote bad things, you
Hmm.
start to see maybe some of the nuance in that and get an understanding for what it's like to really be walking in someone else's shoes, right? No, I think movies can try to do that, right? But one limitation of like a moving image or a photograph
Hmm.
is it is a little surface level.
Yeah.
It's not gonna, even like the most beautiful psychological thrillers,
Hmm.
that can create a sensory experience, even if the writing is great, right? But I think because there's a lot of sensory input exciting our dopamine in that moment, you're
Yeah.
not really getting into the deeper meditative aspects, right? And I say this as someone who loves movies, right? And has
Yeah.
been moved by many great movies. But, it does something different as a
Yeah.
storytelling device than a novel does.
Yeah, it's kind of like you said, it's kind of the opposite of what we were talking about with photographs, especially where it's like the photograph is, like you said, it's very surface level and it's the it's kind of the shell that removes the soul out of something that then has to be re-injected into it because it's just the image, with those things being kind of like more overtones rather than inherent. And with writing, especially with books and with fiction and things like that, it's kind of the opposite. There's no image. The image is what you have to bring to it, and um, it's all that form, it's all that soul underneath it. And so it's
Yeah.
it's it's a lot more intimate in that respect. Yeah, I've never really thought of that before. That
Yeah.
is a really interesting way to look at writing.
I
So hmm?
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I think like with all mediums, whether it's photography or film or music, people relate to having a human touch in it.
Yeah.
Like people kind of like the light leaks in the photograph because that shows that like someone maybe didn't have the perfect setting, right? The machine
Hmm.
itself was made by human hands, right? People like the grain in the film. And with music, people like the warm crackle,
Hmm.
of a radio recording,
Yeah.
right? I think we really relate to that side of things. And even like in therapy, people want a therapist who feels human, who isn't
Hmm.
just like a validation machine, right? Who
Yeah.
like is someone they feel has had a life, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes not to get on my like AI is bad for the arts soapbox and
Yeah.
bad for therapy as a field and all of that, because I know there's nuance in that discussion, right?
Hmm.
But I think the human aspect of all these mediums is going to become even more important as we go forward.
Yeah. I mean, it's the symbol that I love to talk about whenever I can, of from Greek mythology, of the psychopomp, the person who, like you started this episode with talking about, has kind of traversed the realms of hell and of all those experiences and comes back purely by the choice that they're going to come back and to help other people. And that's kind
Yeah.
of, I think, why, as helpful as the AI side of art, or not of art, but of like the AI side of technology can be in some respects, it can never replace that, that intimate human desire, or that intimate human, I think, yeah, desire to come back from suffering and to give back to the community.
Yeah. A robot can't go to hell because why would it?
No, yeah,
You
why would
know,
it?
it's too smart for that. It's something that's like, there's things that, going to hell and coming back, I think are purely human things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because all ChatGPT would do is read Dante's Inferno and give you an analysis of it rather than actually living Dante's Inferno. And I think that that's
Yeah.
something that always has bothered me about like the tech bro way of looking at the usefulness of AI, because basically what they're saying is like that everything that we do can just be reduced down to an observation and a formula, and it's like
Mm,
that's not what being alive is, and I think we all know that, but it feels like some people don't want to talk about that, and those are
yeah.
the people making the AI, sadly.
Right. And it's sad because I think we live in a society that's very oversaturated with information,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes it does help to know, but sometimes it doesn't help to know,
Hmm.
right? And what actually helps is experiential,
Yeah.
right? You can read every single book about depression and still be depressed,
Hmm.
right? It takes actually confronting your fears, sitting with a feeling, letting it move through you,
Yeah.
right? In order to, you know, actually get through something, you
Hmm.
know. Who was talking about this? I don't know. I read somewhere it's, that difference between, um, the study and the analysis and the ritual, right? You can
Mm.
read how to
Hmm.
play the drums, but you're not going to feel it,
Yeah.
that ritual of the drum until you're in it. And like anyone who's like played percussion or played in a band, if there's a good
Hmm.
drummer, it's like it can be a spiritual, physical experience,
Yeah.
right? And, I think more and more the powers that be want to rob us of that. So
Yeah.
finding ways to get it, and that's even what I'm trying to do it with the podcast I'm trying to do for Mount North, is trying to make the conversation itself something like that,
Hmm.
right? So listeners feel like they're in the room there, right?
Hmm.
Maybe like listening to, kind but firm older siblings have conversations about
Yeah.
things, right? And just like feel a part of something in some way.
Yeah. It really is great. And I mean, yeah, as someone who plays drums, that is definitely what's always kept me playing and coming back to them, is, and really anything is just, I never thought of that before. Like it's the ritual of it. You're right. It's the hapticness of embodying the thing that you're doing. Um,
Yeah.
with that podcast, that actually is a really interesting, that's an interesting way of looking at the podcast medium. I haven't thought about that before. What are some other thoughts that you're thinking of, like how to expand that podcast into something that can be really helpful for people?
Yeah. So I think what's important is to be as real as possible. Because when you let yourself, as a host, and you know this because you've talked
Yeah.
to a lot of people, when you let yourself like be yourself, other people respond to that. And I think people are very hungry for authenticity, right?
Mhm.
They're not like looking to be marketed to, right? They're looking to have a human experience, right? This is why people used to turn on the radio, because they wanted to hear
Mhm.
someone talking, right? And the best radio folks were people who, were emotionally present, even if they were telling like fiction stories like Orson Welles,
Mhm.
right? But what's that classic thing about the Orson Welles radio stories? People thought it really happened,
Yeah.
because he's so real, right?
Yeah.
Even when he's telling a fake story, he's real.
Mhm.
And I think that's a big part of it, wanting to give that warm feeling. The podcast is called Coming Home,
Okay.
right?
I like
And
that.
it's that idea of, coming home to the self, and how we all have, you know, moments in life where we feel like, we just stop doing the fake shit and
Mhm.
we like actually get real with ourselves, and something just comes in alignment with us,
Yeah.
and sometimes that's like geographically moving back, like
Mhm.
I did, but it doesn't have to be. It can just be, choosing to do things a little differently, right? Or choosing to tune in to the person you want to be,
Mhm.
right? It's that shift that happens inside of people, right? And, um, I think it's a process that doesn't just happen once, it happens multiple times, right? So, something we're going to be doing with the podcast, in addition to, giving some people some helpful information and like relevant information about topics too, is, asking every guest what their coming home moment was for them,
Yeah.
or what one of those moments was.
Yeah. That's really great. I mean, I love that as a concept, and I think that I really hope that does help a lot of people, because that sounds like an awesome way to approach the podcast medium. Um, yeah, and that's right. I mean, that's what's always drawn me to doing this in the first place, and why I've loved podcasts for a lot longer than I've done them, because as someone who loves talking to people but always doesn't always know the way to get into a conversation, like just kind of being the fly on a wall in somebody else's conversation, and the way that you put it, being like the younger sibling as two older siblings talk with a bit more experience, I think is something that has made this a really lasting medium, and is making it something that I think is probably going to stick around for a lot longer.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, if you're asking good questions, listeners start to ask those questions for themselves,
Hmm.
and, that's awesome, right? It
Yeah.
just sort of helps people, think about maybe what they already wanted to be exploring in themselves anyway,
Hmm.
give them some tools, right? And some possible paths for whatever journey they're on,
Hmm.
and providing some companionship too,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Well, that's really great. And I think that that's probably a good place that we can start kind of wrapping up here. But before we go, I do want to ask one final question. It's something that we've already kind of talked a lot about in terms of community and art. But what what continues to bring you hope, day by day, as you
Mm,
go through everything that life has to offer?
I see a lot of people doing kind, compassionate, selfless things, even when it's inconvenient.
Hmm.
I see a lot of evidence of that. And, I see it through the work that I do, but I see it in the world too.
Hmm.
And, there's a lot of reasons to be depressed about the state of the world, and like justifiably so,
Hmm.
right? That has to be felt so it can change. I think, though, historically, the way people have always gotten through it is
Hmm.
by banding together,
Hmm.
against impossible odds. Like, I think of Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
right? There's these impossible odds, and, it's a difficult task, but people find a way because it matters, and they find a way to treat each other well because it matters,
Yeah.
So I think that's what gives me hope.
Well, thank you for coming on, Claire. I'd love to have you on
Yeah.
again. And you're doing a lot of really great work, so keep doing that.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.